Myriad objects partake of the Buddha body, and sitting upright under the Bodhi tree, you immediately leap beyond the boundary of awakening. At this moment, you turn the unsurpassably great Dharma wheel and expound the profound wisdom, ultimate and unconditioned. Later in that same fascicle, he says, because earth, grass, trees, walls, tiles, and pebbles all engage in Buddha activity, those who receive the benefit of wind and water caused by them are inconceivably helped by the Buddha's guidance, splendid and unthinkable, and awaken intimately to themselves. Those who receive these water and fire benefits spread the Buddha's guidance based on original awakening. Because of this, all those who live with you and speak with you will obtain endless Buddha virtue and will unroll widely inside and outside of the entire universe. The endless, unremitting, unthinkable, unnameable Buddha Dharma. At this time when things seem fraught, when things seem, difficult, the reminder that the interconnectedness of all things, whether it's animate or inanimate, and the fact that we all awaken together, but more importantly, we're already awakened. The idea that we are already free, for me, brings me great solace and helps to kind of take the edge off of that fear and anxiety that I sort of carry around with me, especially if I've watched too much news or had a particularly trying day at work. And to me, this is the great part of our practice together, is that right in the midst of our lives, right in the midst of the wild things, right in the midst of our fear and upset and anxiety and difficulties, that is where we find peace. That is where we can find liberation. And that once we can find it in ourselves or trust that everything else is finding it in themselves, there's this great release. Because that's the miracle of this interconnectedness and interdependence, is that I don't have to be unafraid. I can allow your unafraidness, your own connection to your awakening to help me find mine. I have a really great circle of friends, some of whom I've known for about 30 years. And oftentimes we exchange hope with each other. If I'm having a particularly difficult period of time, they'll remind me that I can borrow their hope. I can borrow their own faith in me and faith in my own awakening, faith in my own liberation. Not all of them are Buddhists, but the gist of what they're saying is exactly that. And so when I can remember that because earth, grass, trees, walls, tiles, and pebbles are all engaged in this great Buddha activity, and that everyone receives the benefit of that great Buddha activity, when we can rest in it, when we can get quiet. And this to me is why I practice seated meditation, why I bring myself daily to remember the peace that comes when I can sit down on a cushion and just allow. When I can stop fighting my own self and my own life and my own practice and my own fears, stop wrestling with these demons and just sit and let it happen. Because that's awakening. That's liberation. It's not that that stuff goes away. It's that I don't have to fight with it. I don't have to argue with it. I don't have to struggle. And as someone who lives in chronic pain and someone who lives with some mental health issues, that to me is such an important and powerful message. And if I do that every day, I sit down and I allow, then throughout the day, I have this reminder of what it's like to not wrestle, to not struggle against myself, to be at peace in the wild things. The other gift of continuous practice, the other gift of sitting down daily and getting quiet and allowing is also, oh, I don't even, I'm trying to think of a word that just escaped me. I had it a second ago. The other thing that happens is that we start to realize that the things that we think of as wild and difficult and hard start to take on a bit more roundness, a bit more softness. So my anxiety today, 30 years on, is a little softer and less sharp than it was 30 years ago when I started this practice. Because of repeatedly sitting down and allowing, it starts to become a bit more right-sized. When I first started all of this, the first sitting group I ever went to was led by a guy named Howie Cohen, and I don't really remember a lot about that first experience, but what I do remember is that at the end of it, he was saying some things, and then he said nothing was broken. And this was the epitome of, I literally said to myself, that's bullshit. I can't, no, that, like, I'm completely broken. I have nothing but grief going on in my life. I don't know how to manage it. I've done all the things. I've done all the therapy. I've done all the work and self-help groups and support groups and peer-led groups. And I was miserable. And here's this guy who, after 25 minutes of pretty much pure torture of trying to sit still and trying to be quiet, who just said nothing was broken. And honestly, I like to joke that I came back just so that I could argue with him, which is in keeping with my personality. But really, I don't know why I came back again. But I did. And eventually, what I figured out, and what I still try to remind myself on a regular basis, is that given the causes and conditions of my life up until that moment, how could it have been anything else? How could my grief and loss and anxiety and fear and self-loathing and self-doubt, how could it be anything other than that? So it wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended. Because that was the tool set I had. So fast forward a few years, and I'm at Pasahara training. It's my first practice period. And I think it was probably 2 or 3 weeks in. And I came in for a meeting with the person leading the Dokusan, or leading the practice period. And the I just sat down and was like, I'm so fucking tired of everything. Because this is what happens, right? You go to Tassajara and you bring yourself there. It's not all joy and light and ease, especially in the first couple of weeks. And I just was like, I can't do this anymore. And he, Reb, in all of his brilliance, just looked at me and said, "What else? Okay, great. What else are you gonna do?" I didn't have an answer, right? Because what else is there to do? This is my body. This is my anxiety. This is what I got, right? This is me. What else can I do? To me, that's such a great awakening and kind and compassionate response. In the moment, didn't feel that way, but at the time, after a little reflection, it was like, oh yeah, because what else are we going to do, right? You've got what you've got. You've got the body and mind and causes and conditions and the experience you have. So you might as well make peace with it. You might as well figure out a way how to rest in it and eventually find an appropriate response in each moment. Because the truth is even as familiar as things feel, they're never the same. So my anxiety today is different than my anxiety yesterday, is different than my anxiety last year when, like it's always different. And so it's always a matter of finding peace in this one, in this moment, and then finding out what's the appropriate response to this. Because even things like my chronic pain, okay? So I've had chronic pain for about 25 years. And I mean chronic, like it's never not hurting. But there are days when it feels different than it does on other days. There are moments it feels different than it does at other moments. Darlene Cohen once said to me when we were talking about this chronic pain thing and sort of living it with chronic illness, she's like, well, what else is there? When you're having the experience, what else is going on? because it's never just pain. It's never just my illness. And see, that's the other thing that happens when you sit down and get quiet and get at peace in the wild things. You realize, oh, wait, there's the wild things, but then there's also the flowers and the trees and the walls and the compassion of all the people who love and care about you and the joy of people who are having moments of joy. Like the world is way bigger than just me and my chronic illness. And when I can get quiet, I can start to tap into that in some kind of way so that I start to experience it differently. Finding peace in the wild things, with the wild things. Finding peace and ease in the middle of the grass, trees, walls, tiles, pebbles, earth. In the midst of all of that, allowing ourselves to awaken with, because of, and sometimes in the midst of all of it. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be. I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty, on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. Thank you very much for your attention. I think this is a great space for us to ask questions. Make comments.
Reverend Daigan, can you hear me?
I can't really hear you.
Let me try. I'm going to switch the microphone because I'm sitting at the computer. Hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, now it's on the computer. I'll return it to the other one for everybody else. But you were just making me think. I found that I have this nice ability in the sort of like when there's a tornado. I'm got a good eye of the storm, a nice calm that just does seem to happen in chaotic or emergency situations, which I'm appreciative. I don't know how it happens or where it comes from, but I'm glad that it happens. But I've got this perverted thing that when things are calm, I create tornadoes. Any thoughts of that or any experience in that kind of routine?
Yeah. First, I'll say that it's the ability to find calm in the midst of the tornado, and also the need to create a tornado in the midst of calm sometimes, and I'm not saying all the time, but sometimes it's actually a trauma response. So I grew up in a really difficult and tumultuous environment. And so for me, finding myself able to respond in those moments in this calm, sort of level-headed kind of way was really my way of like responding to this upset, which is different than the resting in the wild, in the place of the wild things. It's different because it's not in the midst of it. It's in some ways it's a dissociation, right? Like it's I just have to get through this. So and so those are two different things. And I also know that part of what happens is because I'm so used to everything being screwed up, because I'm used to everything being tumultuous, it took me a long time to figure out that I don't have to do that, right? Like, because that's what I was familiar with. When it wasn't that, I had to make it that so that that's how I could operate and function. And so part of my healing, part of my practice has been, and that's what's great about like finding a place of rest and peace and coming into this place of ease, right? And allowing rather than responding out of my hurt and upset, but really coming to peace and finding an appropriate response, getting closer to this idea of, well, what's appropriate in this moment? And as someone who did the same thing, right? Like I created lots of tornadoes in my life. Like it took me a long time to figure out that came, like I don't have to do that. You know, it's the same thing as like taking the physical experience of pain and trying to see what else is there in my body existing in this moment besides the pain. And also it's starting to realize I don't have to wrestle with my experience anymore. I can find ease in it. And sometimes that allows me to see, oh, look, I'm really uncomfortable with how quiet everything is. I'm really uncomfortable with how easy my life is right now. I have this urge, right? We start to get closer to seeing the mental gymnastics we sometimes go through before we do them.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar. I grew up in a household of conflict, so I think it's sometimes if there's no conflict, it doesn't feel like my life or my home. And I caught myself thinking this awful thought once that like in order to be close to people, you have to have conflict with them and work through that. But now I'm like, do you? Maybe you don't.
Exactly. And you can start to see like our tendency to lean in that direction, right? Like we start to catch ourselves.
Oh, yeah.
So on a regular basis, I would sit down with my teacher and I would say something to the effect of, I'm struggling with this, or I'm wrestling with this, or I'm having, you know, like I would be in conflict with my life rather than, and he would just say, well, stop wrestling. Stop struggling. Which allowed me to start to see like my tendency to move into directions that didn't really suit me, that weren't really appropriate for the moment, that were actually leading me towards guilt and remorse and shame and more of what I always had, right? So to just kind of realize like, oh, wait, this is part of my makeup. Okay, I want to create havoc right now. Do I need to? Is there something else I could do? Maybe I need to tell the person, look, I feel like our relationship here, our friendship here is going really well, and I'm trying to convince myself to create havoc. And I just want you to know that, because I don't want to do that. The ability to tell on ourselves, even if it's just to ourselves. Like, our ability to tell ourselves the truth, I think, is the greatest gift this practice has to offer us. Thank you very much for that question.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Ocean. You have to unmute yourself. There we go.
Technology. We have you on the Instagrams as well. So first I want to speak on behalf of Hojo-san, Reverend Mio, who is without a microphone connection, and wanted to thank you for coming to speak to the Sangha today. So we're very grateful. And your talk is just really touching and helpful in these turbulent times. And every time I hear the poem that you read by Wendell Berry, there's another poem so similar. And I was just just read the short last paragraph. Just, I don't know, it kind of echoes and holds, to me anyway, what you've been saying. Then what I am afraid of comes. I live for a while in its sight. What I fear in it leaves it, and the fear of it leaves me. It sings, and I hear its song.
Beautiful. And do me a favor and email me that later. Because, yeah, you're right. It goes exactly with this. There's an old Zen story, and I'm sure Reverend Mio can cite the case number and all of that. I just remember it this way. A student goes up to the mountains to meditate and is just racked with demons in the cave, the cave that he's going to meditate in, and disturbed and can't, and does all the things. And he comes down to his teacher and is like, look, I've tried to meditate for a week and all the demons come and they're just constantly disturbing me and I don't know what to do and I don't know how to clear them out. And the teacher says, feed your demons cake. And of course, the student bows and becomes enlightened, goes up, feeds the demons cake, and they all make friends and the demons go away and enlightenment happens. And, as is often the case in Zen stories. But this, a lot of times for me, this line, feed your demons cake, just comes through it cuts through my own struggle, my own life with the demons, right? Like it's such a great analogy to just really, oh yeah, let me feed the demons cake. Let me, and it sometimes it also includes the story of the student who goes to the teacher and says, what is Buddha? And the Buddha says, this very mind is Buddha. Both of those are the things that often come to me in my moments. With the news of coming out of Afghanistan and the stuff going on and the stories coming out and these people say this thing and these people say this thing, and I just keep reminding myself that this very mind is Buddha. That yes, war is evil and war is demonic and war is all of those things and blowing up people, but This is part of the human experience too. And allowing myself to find the ease in my anxiety about these things, right? Because the truth is, I'm not engaged in any of that stuff. I'm not connected. I'm not a veteran. So, you know, like none of that stuff other than my own commitments to, you know, nonviolence and other human beings and the eradication of suffering. But it's still like my anxiety level just skyrocketed, and I found myself crying the other day around this stuff, and I just kept reminding myself that this mind is Buddha, this grief is Buddha, this fear, this anxiety is Buddha, and that I can only affect change in this one and trust that the change in this one ripples out. Right? Because as Dogen Senji said, you know, the effects of this awakening ripples throughout all space and time and through all the sentient and unsentient beings. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Davidson.
Hi. I'm wondering what the cake is. Would you say the mind itself is Buddha?
Mm.
Or what?
Yeah, you know, I think it's different depending on the demon. And I think that's the appropriate response, right? Like that's the trying to come in contact with what's appropriate in this moment. So I don't know what the cake is for you. I don't even know ahead of time what the cake is for me. But I usually find it when I stop struggling and can listen and get close to my own grief or my own, when I can get close to the demon and let it tell me what it wants. Was that a good answer?
That's good enough for now.
I love you so much, David. I saw another hand. I don't know who raised it. Oh, yes, please. Tell me how to say your name first.
Yes, thank you, Reverend Daigan. My name is Janosch,
Janosch.
and I really enjoyed your talk. Because in my practice, what I have found, what I took away from here for your talk is sort of an allowing to be with what my demons are rather than struggling. And when I can sit and really, as what the Buddha says, is absorb, you know, all those bodily sensations going along with my anxiety, and to befriend, to actually befriend the tightness in my belly, and rather than pushing that away, say, oh, just hold that and notice, and I'll notice different things about it and how it changes. And then that sort of tightness informs me or changes, and then, you know, I may have a thought around that change, and that whole process of befriending and being with it's enlightening to me to say, oh, my belly or this tightness is really, about some fear, and then just being, it's the whole process. What's this fear around? And then the fear, rather than pushing it away, is like, yeah, I'm having a hard time with X, Y, and Z. And so when I can just be, yeah, that's it, I am having a hard time. And so just go gentle with that. It's like, oh, rather than my stomach hurting, it's like it changed to being gentle with X, Y, and Z.
Right.
Yeah. So thank you. And I also, that is my practice of sort of being with the wild things and with nature. And if I'm not sleeping, I will put myself, into a place that I just feel comfort in, some kind of wild place, and it is very calming. So I always resonate with the Buddha finding enlightenment just sitting under this tree. So there's something to be taught for that. And just maybe your own comments as you started with this wild things, that I think has brought me into this practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And what's true is all of what you said is absolutely right, and it's totally in line with the Buddhist teachings. And I want to say too that what happens when we stop wrestling and we start allowing and we notice, we can also hear it, right? What's the request? So as I notice that, oh, this stomach tightness and pain is actually fear, I can start to hear, I can say like, okay, what's the request of that fear? What's the request of my practice? What is it to practice with this thing? Which also aids me in not pushing it away, but also not clinging to it, right? Like I start to hear the request. And I think that's when the practice becomes awakening, when we start to hear the request of that moment. When it's not just knowing and allowing, but we start to, that's the feeding of the demon, right? Like that's the cake, is the request. And so for me, like, yes, all of that. And then just maybe as you start to notice it, start to ask yourself, well, okay, that's fear. What's that want? What's the request? How, like, sometimes it's old fears from when I was a kid, and the request is to just love myself for a moment, right? Or sometimes it's just the request is just sit here and breathe with it. Sometimes it's to go outside and put my hands on earth, right? Because that's the moment of awakening for the Buddha, was when he touched the earth and said, I and all beings are now awake. So yeah, what's the ask? What's the request? And the only way to hear that is if you're quiet. I've never heard it in the midst of my own chaotic, I think of those rides you used to ride on as a kid where it spun really fast and it glued you up against the wall. So sometimes that's my mind or that's my body, and I can't hear the request in that place. But when it stops and everything falls off the wall, that's when I can hear it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I like that metaphor of like in the question about what's the request. Thank you.
It's called a tilt-a-whirl.
Anyone else? I think it might be a wrap. Shall we close?